My name is Luke O'Connor. I work at Zurich Financial Services, and I just list my blog authorship here just so this means I can say whatever I want, more or less, to the audience. It doesn't have to be too corporate, but just to let you know, I do actually work in the field besides just writing about it. So this is a talk. This is a talk that I gave at the OWASP conference one day, and we thought this might be interesting to everybody here. Just a little bit about me. I spent a certain amount of time in doing industrial research when I came to Switzerland to work for IBM some years ago. So there we basically, what people might need. I did consulting for 5 years, so try and find out what people want. And then I worked in-house for 5 years, where we're meant to say what people expect when they don't know what they want or what they might need. Right? So I've really had the three areas. So this is typically the security person, and this is what you look like when you go to risk. And actually, with Arnold, I guess there'll be another photo now. He's not very happy at all. Anyway, so all I'm saying is that I have seen 2 or 3 facets of how the world works. Right? So the title here is about is there going to be something in IT? Is there a 2.0 for IT risk management? And of course we take this idea from web development, and there was a big change from 1.0 to 2.0. So if you remember, 1.0 was about smart people, technical people, geeks, coming to the forefront. Yeah? And actually, Web 2.0 is about being smart about people. Geeks have kind of disappeared in some sense. I think they're still around, but they're not as popular as a new group of people who have arisen in the Web 2.0 space. So the question is, for IT risk management, are we likely to have a similar transition? I would say IT risk management 1.0 was just do it. It needed doing. Everybody else in the company was doing risk. IT people need to step up and do the same thing as well. And sometimes we had methods which worked, sometimes they didn't. We kept on going. But I think now it's been going on for long enough where we can actually maybe look at the 2.0 and say, should we keep going? Should we keep doing the same things? Or can we get this type of transition between a 1.0 and a 2.0? Is it just a change in focus, or is it a change in technique? Is it a change in our importance in the company? And I would say yes, there is a 2.0, but we're going to have to work a little bit hard to focus on that 2.0, and probably you are the people who can help with this. Right? So risk, in some general sense, looks like this. I think you pick up pretty much any book on risk, whether it be particularly to do with IT. We have scenarios, what could happen, triggers, how it could happen, consequences, what you don't want to happen. And then associated with that, we have a probability. How often can these bad triggers happen, and the severity, how bad is bad. Now, I would say, I think most of the security people, normally we're pretty good at estimating this, having a good feeling on what this is. This is the big worry for most people in risk. Not just IT risk, but all forms of risk. So I do work for an insurance company. Of course, they're crazy about this, but only when they have data. So to do with your life insurance, of course, this is very important. In fact, now it's very interesting. There's the risk of people living too long. Across the years, they've made all these policies to pay people money for dying on time, and now they're living longer, right? And it's called longevity risk. Yeah. So there's a great white paper you can read about this. So some things like improved blood pressure, heart surgery techniques. This is making people live on average 3 years longer. So, and I think in our case we have a lot of trouble with this probability. So I mean, this is the general circumstance, and in IT we normally break it down, even IT security context. Anyone know where this diagram's from? Which standard?
Fair.
No, that's a fair guess. No, it's actually from an Australian standard. I quite like it. So now we break down the problem even smaller. I mean, threats lead to vulnerabilities, impact assets, rise to security risks. We try and address our requirements better and produce better controls, and this process is on and on. I mean, it's quite common, this type of diagram. And I mean, one problem I have in the field, for example, is that we always talk about threat analysis. What are the threats? And actually, I think the threats are quite constant. Whether it be hackers, be employees, be rogues. The real thing that changes over time is the vulnerabilities. How these people or processes can exploit. But you don't hear that sort of vulnerability analysis. That's sort of more at the network level. But this is the space that we're working in. So what's the persistent challenges we have with working with this type of model? Okay, how to identify important vulnerabilities. So I don't know, in our company we run Qualys, which is a network scanning tool, and okay, we're a global company, but it produces each month, I would say, over 10,000 vulnerabilities, which when printed out in PDF is several thousand pages. So the actual tool, which is meant to help you find vulnerabilities, you then need another tool to analyze the output of that tool, and then you send it to Bruce Schneider's company, Counterpain, and they will do something for you, right? But actual finding vulnerabilities is not hard. Finding the important ones is the difficult thing. Now, when you talk about vulnerabilities, if they're exploited, they impact your IT assets. How do you value your IT assets? And this is a point about how important, how serious you want to get to about risk management. So again, I work for an insurance company, and if you can't value something, you have a real problem with that. And it's very hard in general. It's not just for IT, but actually for operational risk, valuing assets. How to judge if security controls are effective and adequate. I think we probably all make a lot of our business living out of doing exactly this. For audit companies. Oh, yeah, and all these things change over time. So even if you have something wonderful for today, RSA goes and lose your secure ID seed, and suddenly your equation changes. Or your IT supplier that does your main network configuration, they have a security vulnerability. So these things are very dynamic. And then if you can do all of these things, it's sometimes often hard to find a good management message. What can we tell management that they really want to hear? And not only what they want to hear, but something they will act on. And then on top of that, just demonstrate that the whole process is really working. We're not just throwing people and money and time at it, it's actually productively doing something for us. So, just to let you figure out, just to give you an idea of how hard this problem can be, this is a topic which was in my company, but I guess it's in lots of companies, password expiry. How often should users change their passwords? Hands up in the company. Who's at 3 months or less? 3 months or less? 6 months or less? A year. Some people out to a year? A year ago? There we go. Okay. More than a year. Okay, so not many. Yeah. We had to actually make an argument about this recently because users had to change them every 45 days. And they wanted to go out to 3 months. People were out to 90 days. Why? What do you need to know to kind of answer this type of question, right? 3 things, I think. How resistant is your password to guessing? how many guesses can an attacker make on your password? And then you can determine how long the password should be living around. And you find that these numbers, which are quite straightforward to state, are very, very difficult to determine. Yeah. Which is why, in some sense, we fall back on these rules of thumb, right? To say password should be changed every 3 months, password should be changed every 6 months. Right? And sometimes you ask people, well, yeah, I believe you, but where did that come from? Well, yeah, I used to be working at this company with this guy, and he said it should be 3 months. Yeah, and then he'd been working in security for 20 years, and he knew one of the people who wrote the actual Orange Book in America, and this was a good thing to do. Yeah. I mean, it's simply the case that I think if you want to be effective at risk management, we have to know what we're doing and why. Okay, we have to rely a little bit less on historical data is good, but historical rumors, no, this we have to get rid of. So the traditional security approach, say like if someone's trying to guess your password, is you say, if you guess 3 times, then you get a lockout, which I almost have today on my laptop. When you think about it, what does this mean? So if you draw an axis here, say number of guesses, and here you have likelihood of success, and it's breaking into your password. What we're really saying is after 1, 2, 3 guesses, there's this threshold. And if your password can resist 3 guesses, then it's wonderful. And that 4th guess, it's critical. Suddenly, you bounce over some threshold, and no. I mean, and when you think about the reasoning, this really can't be right. Yeah. Normally, if your password can resist 3 guesses, I think it could take 4, maybe even 5, maybe even 10. You may not know, but the config worm, it had a collection of 200 passwords. And when it hit an administration account which had no password lockout, it was able to get through a lot of the time, just on 200 passwords. So someone like NIST, this just means if you go to my blog, there's an article about this. But NIST actually did a stronger analysis, right? We've actually tried to figure out, you set a parameter here to say, I want my password to be broken with, say, probability 1 in 10,000. And if I'm going to leave it, not change it for a year, how many guesses can I allow people to have? So I don't know if NIST is implementing this, but at least they try to go. This is far more a risk-based approach to do this type of analysis. Or you can get really serious. So this type of analysis from NIST was okay. And I gave this talk before, and I had taken this slide from Dr. Sarbati's thesis, saying, before you can start throwing some really serious math at it. And in fact, I kind of left this off, but this was like equation 49, 50, 51. So maybe you could just say a few words. I mean, did this help management out to understand this problem a bit more?
Well, in my opinion, you're overemphasizing the math here.
Believe me, I couldn't make this up.
The thing is that if you go back to the basic assumptions that are behind it, it's much more easier to understand and also much more easier to communicate to management. So this, of course, this looks horrible, but you do this once, and you don't need to do this. And once you have the formula, it's okay, and you just adopt it. And you can program it, and that's it. But I think more important are the basic assumptions behind this formula.
I mean, are you still basically using these parameters? I guess?
Yeah, exactly.
Were you able to find some good estimates for these parameters?
I never went. Well, I haven't done. No, I haven't.
We'll go for a drink later on.
But you're ignoring other attacks on password with this analysis.
Oh, this is really online. Sorry. I'm assuming now this is an online attack. If you're doing offline, okay.
Plus shoulder surfing, plus deliberate sharing of passwords.
Oh, yeah. So this is just trying to capture what you could possibly capture. So if you put in a parameter here, likelihood to be shoulder surfed, I wouldn't even know how to
It
estimate.
depends on the environment, anyway.
just one quick remark. I'm certain the formula could be adapted to answer your specific question there. So the formula was actually stated to see, it's quite a long time, but it's quite a long time ago. But was a different kind. It answered a different kind of question.
A long time ago. I know what that feels like. We're younger and stronger. I mean, the general issue that we're trying to get at, and I think this is from your thesis too, right? Is really having some notion of vulnerability and the threat against that vulnerability, putting up a control against it. And the risk, in some sense, is this gap between what could happen and the controls that we put there. So, I mean, cracking passwords is really an example of this, right? So we put controls on how many guesses you can make, protection of the password file, and yeah, how likely or good is the attack, and what is the resistance of the security mechanism. And we spent a lot of time in this space. So, I mean, this is a slide I like. Because another one of the problems is this confusion between controls and risks. Who has the difference between control and risk clear in their head? Or whose management has the difference between control and risk in their head? I mean, because what happens is, you take someone like Herbert, there's control objectives, lots of control objectives. Then you have controls. So control objectives is something you must have. Controls enforce your control objective. Then you do an assessment. And typically things are okay, could be okay, not okay. And you then have these gaps. So I'm here and I should be up here, And what people automatically do typically is say that this gap is risk. We don't have a control objective unless there's a risk. And if the controls are not working, then that's what risk means. So often, for many people, the control and risk are two sides of the same coin. And at least in my company, and other companies that I've seen, this causes a lot of, how can I say it, trouble with the risk function because it looks like a control function. Because people aren't doing anything special. Audit suddenly becomes a risk function too. They start doing risk-based audits because, of course, they can measure gaps. They're fantastic. In the past, they weren't calling them risks; they were calling them ineffective findings. So I think we really have to get out of this space. We have to leave controls to the people who check controls, and that's not the risk function. That's the audit function, or the internal control network function, shall we say. I mean, if we're not checking controls, what type of stuff are we doing? Well, maybe one way to help us understand what we should be doing is to look at what other people do in other fields, not IT fields. This is analysis of from California, where they're trying to build a levee, which is a small dam, to stop flooding. And they want to know how high to build the dam to prevent the flooding on a reasonable basis. So, the flooding comes once a year. There's a 1 meter flood. Every 5 years there's a 10-year flood. Every 20 years it's bigger flood, right? Now, of course, you can build the dam 1 meter, 2 meters, 5 meters, 10 meters, no trouble. It just costs you more money to build it, right? And more money to maintain it. So it's kind of an optimization problem here, right? How high do I have to build the dam such that when the flooding comes, once a year, once every 10 years, the cost is not too bad. Now for me, there's so actually you can plot this, right? So as it turns out, it's the best case is, I think, over here, right? So in this case, you built it, so you have these simple measure things: the total cost of building, running the dam, expected annual damage when you have a flood, annualized cost of running it, and the recurrence period. So the recurrence period is the size of the flood. And you put these equations in, put these numbers in, and you come back with a sweet spot. Now, I often think, couldn't we do this for antivirus? Because antivirus is really doing something like this, right? Constantly being attacked by probes, by email, by attackers. We want that to be stopped, you know? Pretty much all the time. But every now and again, there's a flood. Something gets over, and we have a configure, and we get damage. In my place, we call what's called a security incident, and then we shut down all the servers, and it costs us a lot of money. But I've never seen this type of analysis done for how good is antivirus. I don't know if it's a good investment that we use Symantec, right? I don't really know if it's a good investment that we do with Symantec, right? I don't know what fraction of vulnerabilities they're stopping. But we normally don't focus on this. What we normally focus is we create a CSIRT team, and when something gets through Symantec, we ring a big bell, and we clean it up. And then actually we all stand up and say, see, we can clean things up. We're not very good at stopping things. So, but this would be a great message if you could have it, right? If you really want to come forward and say, this is the reason why we have antivirus. This would be the type of argument. And in other fields they do. See, nobody in California would build a dam or a levee without this type of analysis. It would make sense. And here's another example. I really love this one too. This is to do with the GPS service. So the GPS service that we all use is actually a bunch of satellites up in the sky. And you need to have a certain number of them functioning to actually get the GPS service. And somebody did a study to say that, well, in fact, if we don't do something, that service is going to fail. Okay, so actually there's 30 satellites up there. And at any one point in time, you need 24 to be working. And they need to be working most of the time. And somebody did this graph to basically show that given the rate of failure of the satellites, which are very old now, and the slowness of launching the new satellites, they basically graphed it and said, this is the SLA. This line here is the SLA. And they were able to predict that there's a lot of jittering here. This is sort of launching and the satellites coming back online. But if we don't do anything, there's going to be a dip in service, and it won't come back till sort of 2015. And this is a risk analysis. So all this analysis is done through simulation. All of this analysis, actually, you have to estimate a lot of parameters. But this is a great message to management to say, look, here's your risk based on the information we know. I think this is the type of space that we should try to be in with IT security, right? Maybe you could change this to be, instead of failure of satellites, you could failure of supply, failure of servers, failure of software, failure of personnel. And then we can get a good message, I hope. And actually in this case, the impact's pretty bad, right? Because missiles and things, if the GPS is not accurate, you just have to send more missiles. So there's a big impact. So, and anyway, this has been fixed. I mean, as a risk person, this is the space that I would like to be in, to be able to walk in some, in this case, they walked into US Congress and said, we need to fix this. And there was no argument about fixed. I mean, how often do you go with your senior management with some PowerPoint and there's no answer that this thing needs to be fixed? When we have good data, good problems, we have a good graph. This is what we should be after in risk. Not stuck here. Doing the risk assessment of code. Plenty of people to do that. We need to work a little harder. I think Thomas wants me to stop. Oh, okay, we'll do one more slide, yeah. So, given that we need to do risk, are we actually good at it? I had trouble last time with this term. Who knows what a muggle?
Harry Potter.
Many people didn't know, right? So, no, really, okay, I guess you've got to have children. So, a muggle is this term from Harry Potter for somebody who is not magical. So the whole books are about magicians, right? And anybody who's not a magician is a muggle. So are we risk muggles? You know, so are we actually not competent at this topic at all? So I made this list of good qualities that I think IT people have, and maybe some not so good qualities. So on the good side, we're pretty good at detailed accuracy and correctness. You know, we can be quite thorough. In a risk assessment, you need this, right? We're generally truthful. That's quite helpful. Interested in what we do. Like to know the why behind the what. Most of the time, we want to know why we're doing what we're doing. Strong commitment to things which make sense. Typical of IT. Motivated by technical arguments, yes. We fix broken things. This is good stuff. In some sense, we should make good risk managers. On the not so positive side, we're no good with uncertainty. Something needs to be done, something needs to be fixed, something needs to be installed, something needs to be rolled out, but if someone says, well, maybe this needs to be done, maybe in some time, we're not good with dealing with that. Something which is possible normally means something which could happen is likely to happen. We think like this. So we're a little bit risk averse. We're not good at saying, well, yeah, that's on the radar, but it's far away. One of the we're really bad liars in general, IT people. When we stand up and try and say something which we know is not true, it's really clear, at least all the people I know. And in general, we're not very good at explaining things. So we typically have a lot of knowledge, but it's kind of locked away. Why? Because we're too busy fixing broken things and making things sense that we can't actually tell people about it. Yeah, we have a tendency to point out the mistakes of other people. So, again, we're not good necessarily in groups. Unfortunately, we're typically only good at one area. We're super focused people on our ITs really are. And probably worse, this is what's happened. We have this tendency to reinvent than learn from something else. And this is exactly what's happened in the IT risk space. So even though there's a lot of risk material lying around, a lot of techniques, a lot of tools, we generally start our own again. And this is why we're a little bit stuck in this is why there was information risk management 1.0. We thought it was 0.0 and then we made 1.0, right? And in fact, we could have started at 1.5. So I think we're okay at being at risk, but we have to basically convert some of these weaknesses over to you. And I think we need to have a break now. Yeah, and I come back after the break.
Thank you.
Okay, one of the problems we do have is what I would call data envy. Lots of other serious risk fields have data, and we don't seem to have enough data. Now, I mean, I'm not convinced this is a big problem. One of the examples I like is that Google is quite able to do a lot of information, having a little bit of data and pushing it the right way. And I'm not sure in security that we're pushing things in the right way. The Verizon data breach information report, I really like this report. Who reads this? It's been out for about 4 years, I think now. And it's getting better, I would say. Because now this year behind it, they have actually a whole framework to do with the data that they collect. So it used to be traditionally about people that they observe as their customers, right? So they do data breach investigations themselves, and then they put together their own view. But now they're working with the FBI and maybe other government agencies this time. And actually put together a framework to say this is the data that we're going to collect about all the incidents, and actually you call it classification. So when I read this report, it's quite nice, right? So this is the type of malware by percent which was used in the cases of the breaches that they found, right? So backdoor, keylogger, sending data to external site, download additional malware, data resident systems, RAM scraper. Apparently this is actually stealing data directly from main memory. This is now something important. But I mean, for me, when I see this is almost a fairly good list of vulnerabilities that you can have in your system, right? And even if you're not collecting this amount of information, you have a pretty good idea how you should be. And actually, maybe this is something which is even working against data, risk analysis, is that when you have this type of data, you can almost read off where the problem is, right? The risk analysis is not so strong, you know? It's the same as when you go to the doctor, when they can have the right blood test, it's very clear where your problem is. But this classification, I think, is great, and even if you don't have all the data you need, you're much better able to reason with the top 3 records. So still backdoors, key loggers, and I guess this is big now, sending data just externally out. I mean, a few years ago, you could actually transfer big files out of your, carry them out, right? Now you can just transfer gigabytes out onto the internet. So that's now a problem. And where I work, I would like to put something like this going forward, right? Because never in something like covert or most of the security standards would you get something this detailed. This is really where you need to be, right? If you want to assess these things. So I think that before you start collecting data, you have to know why you're collecting it, right? And you need a framework to begin with to say, this is the data that I think is important. And I think a lot of the time we don't have that. And that's something we should pick up on. Another problem I would say so even if we do know what we should be collecting, there's a problem that the IT risk function is going to be swallowed by compliance. Compliance is somehow a much bigger beast in this sort of IT wilderness. Why? Well, so this is actually a picture of the ISSS compliance thing. Nice graphs, nice understanding. Why is compliance a little bit ahead? Well, normally compliance is achievable. It's something you can actually do. You can set aside a certain amount of time and at the end of it say it's done. Risk management is not that great. It's normally quite understandable. So if there's a gap, if you're not meeting this particular standard, you can say yes, this is what you need to do to meet it. It's actionable. It's really great. It's actionable. And if you have something which is missing, you can assign it to somebody and put a deadline on it and put a time frame and assign some money. Yeah? And it's also unavoidable. Have to be compliant. So risk management doesn't have a lot of these properties, right? You can really avoid it. Yeah? Sometimes it's actionable, sometimes not. It's not always understandable. It's not clear what you achieve. Yeah? In some sense, because risk management has much higher goals, much higher expectations than compliance. And compliance, well, focuses on evidence. They're not speculating about the past. They're not looking too far into the future. They go look right now. And they find, it's like going to the doctor. He tells you what's happening in your life right now. And they're big on findings. Normally not too concerned about what it means or how important it is. It's, we found something. No. There's meant to be 3 of these, and there's only 2 of them. Finding. So, and they're not very big on their conclusions. So, you don't have to stick your neck out too far. You can just say, here's the standard, you're meant to be compliant with it, and, well, in fact, you're not. What does it mean? Well, it means you're not compliant. But, no, you're not compliant. And so then you're back to this. Because for some managers, senior people, just having compliance itself is a valuable thing. It's not questioned. So risk management is in trouble because we're trying to actually tell you something that you don't know, whereas compliance is a much easier task with giving you something that you really need. So at least where I sit, sometimes I start to think that the compliance function, because of these properties, and I think that the compliance is important, of course. It will keep on taking more and more ground away from information risk management because IT compliance is easier to understand. Another threat is that we get swallowed by operational risk. So operational risk is fairly sophisticated set of techniques, which is dealing with loss, straight with loss. And you have these loss curves. And you have a certain amount of loss which is expected. So I work for an insurance company, so every year they expect to pay out a certain amount of money for claims. There's a loss. But it's an expected loss. They basically know how much they're going to have to pay, unless there's something in Japan with nuclear reactors. This is suddenly extreme loss year over year. So basically, the op risk sets aside a certain amount for loss, and then they have this nice term called unexpected loss. That's loss you didn't know you were going to have, but it's okay. It's like you have more money in your bank account normally than you need, and if you need to pay more money this month, you can take it. And then you have this unexpected loss. So typically this is value at risk, and you're computing out to 99.9, 99.999, however far you want to go up. And this is where the whole focus is. And IT, if you have an incident in IT, then this is operational loss. Your system goes down, you lose a data center, you lose a customer tape. And so I think in the big risk framework, IT risk sits inside of here, technically. So an insurance company, typically the IT sits inside operational risk. The problem there is that I would say is that the potential loss from IT is not that high as compared to other losses, at least the way that we calculate them now. So, for example, the insurance company, the amount of money that you put into the market, especially I didn't realize this, but in insurance all this money gets paid in through claims, and we keep some of it to pay losses, then the rest of it we invest. That's a huge amount of money, it's like billions of dollars, much bigger than any of the IT budget you can imagine. And so if we actually calculate this type of distribution, this is like the financial crisis that we just had 2 years ago. That's on a much bigger magnitude for our company, or for Swiss Re, or for Swiss Life, than the IT functions. And so the trouble is here for IT risk is that when you look at the whole spectrum of operational risk, IT risk is just a little piece. So unless we can find some way to like really increase the losses from losing our IT, then we could be forgotten, right? We become decimal points in the equation. Yeah? Because I mean, who's put a cost on losing their data center? Who's had to put a cost on losing their data center? Anybody? I think in our place, yes. I think we were several hundreds of millions of dollars, which is, hey, no one wants to pay several hundred millions of dollars. But if you're investing $2 billion somewhere else, it kind of puts things into perspective. So sometimes when I talk to my colleagues in op risk, they say, "Well, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this IT risk?" Right? We could go blow up the data center tomorrow, and okay, it'll take some time to come back. But we have to really watch what those, people over at Deutsche Bank are doing. They've got a lot of money. So I think that unless we have a more realistic way of representing IT risk, the impact, op risk people come along and say, "Thanks, guys. I mean, you're important, but we're playing in the Premier League and you're playing in the third league." So I've only got 2 more slides. I think part of the problem that we've been dealing with in the current risk management system, and something we can transition from the 1.0 to the 2.0, is we have to stop working on risks bottom up. We can't be going out there and taking a COVID standard or ISO standard or any type of regulation and start doing findings, checking controls, finding things which are not working right. Because it's really a lot of work in the first hand. Second place, there's lots of other people doing that. We don't need to repeat their work. Right? And often, even if we do repeat their work or do it even better than them, we don't know what to do with it. That is, we end up with lots of findings which don't, like a jigsaw puzzle, that we don't know how it actually goes together. And we don't have a management message. I would say going forward, probably the best thing to do is to start with 3 or 4 big risks that you know your management's going to be interested in. And I would say, for me, the top 4 would be loss of data, customer data, business data, loss of service, whether that's an application, the network, loss of supplier, somebody that does your network or application for you, and let's call it loss of compliance. I guess you would call that non-compliance, but just to have these things together. And each of these are really big risks. So when I say big, I actually mean complex. So there's no easy way to answer what is the risk of loss of data. You really have to sit down and analyze many factors. So in Zurich, where I was, we did lose a tape, customer tape. And we had to basically look at the ways that we hire people globally. We had to look at technical systems. We had to look at people processes. We had to look at how information exits out of the company. In the end, about 87 controls. Just to answer this question. No, not even answer this question. To be able to even formulate an argument about it. And there's no clear answer. And I would say it's the same thing here for this loss of service, loss of supply, loss of compliance. These are exactly the things that you open up the Financial Times, and this is what you'll see written about other companies who lost data, service, supply, or compliance. And your senior manager doesn't want to open up the paper and see his company's name or her company's name. And I think if we work on these big risks, as opposed to compliance level risks, let compliance people do compliance, let audit people do audit, let Pricewaterhouse do their job. I'm sure they're great at it. Risk management, this is where we want to be. And maybe in your company you will put down maybe a few more risks. But these are just the top of the pyramid for each one. Then you have to build the whole framework off here on how to apply it. So I think this top-down approach for me is really the way forward. Because actually in our company, I imagine that before we lost this tape, no one really knew how to answer this question. We had to invent a lot of things from scratch. Right? And we realized, we should have this all along. Right? The data is there, but not this focus. Same as the loss on service, supply, and compliance. So I wanted to end by a few questions for discussion. Please, maybe just read them off, and then I'm sure that someone will say something. So, can your IT risk management keep going as it is? Are you delivering value, something that they didn't expect, or are you delivering assurance? Ideas, telling people that they're still risk-free. I mean, do IT people get it? IT people can happily do risk management for years and years and not get it. They're very good at it. Following instructions. Right? Are you waiting to be saved by data? What this means is that you're still doing risk management and think to yourself, I can't do a better job because I don't have the right data. But I'll still do it. I'll still do it anyway. This is an important one. I mean, do you deliver decision support? So this means that is the results of your risk analysis taken serious by management? Or is it the case that before management takes on a new supplier, do they come to you and say, what's the risk of taking on the supplier? Or is it the other way around, right? They take on the new supplier and say, could you please do me risk assessment? I mean, do you have a seat at the stakeholder table? So again, when somebody's making a decision, when somebody wants to be, is the risk management function included there? Or is it more the case, hey, as long as those guys are in the other building and doing the risk management, that's fine. And we'll keep on doing the work. I mean, do you drive your strategy based on risk? IT risk. Again, if you're doing all this risk assessments, does management actually come to you and say, we're thinking about doing this next year? I mean, I think, yeah, that was an important question. That was a driver when I first started with Zurich Financial Services. Yeah, I thought to imagine the head of the CEO, head of IT function comes to you and says, look, in my back pocket I've got $100 million. I'll give it to you. You can spend it on whatever you want if you tell me why. I'll give you a blank check or a big amount of money, right? And you can spend it on whatever you want. Just show me the risk that you're helping by doing this. I know at least where I was, this would be a very hard question to answer because don't think like that. He's meant to pay us $100 million for telling him what the risks are. Yeah? You actually came to us and said, take this and do what you want. We're not used to this role. But I think that's where we should be, right? Because of our knowledge, if you went to a doctor or a medical associate and said, here's $100 million, what more equipment would you buy or drugs would you buy? No trouble, they'd spend $1 billion. They would know exactly where the money should be spent. In IT, not so sure. So